The rolling hills of Bordeaux, shrouded in the silver mist of a chilly Atlantic morning, seem to guard a secret that has defined the upper echelons of European society for over a century and a half. Here, amidst the gravelly soils of the Medoc, the name Rothschild is not merely a signature of banking power, but a symbol of a liquid gold that has fueled dynasties and sparked internal wars. To the world, the labels of Chateau Lafite and Chateau Mouton Rothschild represent the pinnacle of viticultural achievement, yet behind the prestige lies a narrative of fierce sibling rivalry, social climbing, and a desperate search for legitimacy that stretched from the ghettos of Frankfurt to the highest courts of France. The story of the Rothschild wine empire is not just a chronicle of fermentation and terroir. It is a profound study of how a family, once excluded from the aristocracy by their faith and origins, used the vine to conquer the one thing their gold could not immediately buy: a seat at the table of the ancient nobility. It is a story of two branches of the same family, separated by a single road in Pauillac, who spent generations competing for the title of the finest wine on earth, creating a legacy that is as complex and layered as a vintage Cabernet Sauvignon. The origins of this enological obsession can be traced back to the mid-19th century, a time when the five sons of Mayor Amschel Rothschild had already established their financial hegemony across the capitals of Europe. While the London and Paris branches were busy financing wars and building railroads, a new desire began to take root: the desire for land. In 1853, Baron Nathaniel de Rothschild, a member of the English branch living in Paris, took the first step into this uncharted territory. Driven by a need to serve his own wine to his prestigious guests and tired of relying on the local merchants, he purchased Chateau Brun Mouton at an auction. He renamed it Chateau Mouton Rothschild, but his timing was tragically ironic. 2 years later, the historic Bordeaux wine official classification of 1855 was established for the Universal Exhibition in Paris. Despite its quality, Mouton was denied the status of Premier Cru, first growth, being relegated to a second growth. This perceived slight became a stain on the family's honor, igniting a silent fury that would smolder for over 100 years. Nathaniel had acquired a vineyard, but he had failed to acquire the ultimate validation of the French establishment. The stakes were raised significantly in 1868 when Nathaniel's uncle, Baron James Mayer de Rothschild, the powerful head of the French banking branch, made his move. In a maneuver that signaled both immense wealth and a direct challenge to his nephew, James purchased Chateau Lafite, a property that had already been crowned as the king of the first growths. James died just months after the acquisition, but he had secured for his descendants the ultimate prize in the world of wine. This purchase created an immediate and palpable tension within the family. On one side of a narrow path stood Lafite, the undisputed aristocrat of Bordeaux, and on the other stood Mouton, the ambitious outsider constantly striving for a recognition that the rigid laws of French tradition refused to grant. The vineyards became a mirror of the family's internal dynamics, the elder, established French branch possessing the crown jewel, and the younger, Anglo-influenced branch perpetually chasing the throne. For decades, the two estates operated in a state of cordial hostility, with the competition between them driving both to reach heights of quality that would redefine the global wine market. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Rothschilds found that their wine empire was not immune to the tectonic shifts of history. The phylloxera plague, a tiny aphid that decimated the vineyards of Europe, and the subsequent economic depressions tested the family's resolve. Unlike many other estate owners who faced ruin, the Rothschilds used their banking reserves to keep the vines alive, viewing these estates not as profit centers, but as sacred ancestral grounds. However, the true transformation of the empire would come from a young man who arrived at Mouton in 1922, Baron Philippe de Rothschild. Only 20 years old and possessing a theatrical flair that stood in stark contrast to his more conservative cousins at Lafite, Philippe would become the most disruptive force in the history of wine. He looked at the centuries-old traditions of Bordeaux and saw stagnation. His arrival marked the beginning of a modern battle for control, where the weapon was no longer just the quality of the grape, but the power of the brand and the audacity of the individual. The arrival of Baron Philippe de Rothschild at Mouton in 1922 acted as a rebellious spark in a region that was otherwise slumbering under the weight of archaic aristocratic traditions. Philippe was not a traditional landlord. He was a racing driver, a poet, and a visionary who quickly realized that the prestige of Mouton was being eroded by the very commercial system that governed Bordeaux. In the 1920s, it was the standard practice for estates to sell their wine in bulk casks to the négociers, the powerful merchants in the city of Bordeaux, who would then bottle, label, and distribute the wine as they saw fit. This system left the producers with almost no control over the final quality or the authenticity of their product, often leading to tampering or the dilution of the Rothschild name. In 1924, Philippe orchestrated a historic revolution by mandating that the entire harvest be bottled at the estate, mise en bouteille au château. This was an act of open defiance against the merchant class, forcing them to relinquish their grip on the supply chain and returning the ultimate authority to the grower. However, this bold move only served to deepen the rift with his cousins at Chateau Lafite, who viewed such disruptions as a threat to the established order they had dominated for centuries. As Philippe busied himself with the modernization of Mouton, the spectral lines of competition between the two Rothschild branches became increasingly sharp. The divide was not merely the physical path separating the vineyards, it was a fundamental disagreement over how to interpret the family's place in history. At Lafite, the family viewed themselves as the serene custodians of a natural heritage, holding the throne of premier cru as a birthright that required no justification or loud promotion. Conversely, at Mouton, Philippe channeled his resentment at being ranked second into a work of marketing genius. In 1924, he commissioned the graphic artist Jean Carlu to design a label in the Cubist style, beginning what would become a legendary tradition of commissioning a different master artist for every vintage. This transformed a bottle of wine into a collectible piece of high culture, a move that the traditionalists at Lafite regarded as frivolous and unbecoming for a house of their stature. This silent war was fought not just in the fermenting vats, but in the salons of Paris and London, where the quiet tradition of Lafite clashed with the noisy innovation of Mouton. Yet, all personal ambitions and petty rivalries were abruptly silenced by the dark shadow of the Second World War. When the Nazi forces swept into France, the Rothschild wine empire became a primary target for both systemic looting and racial hatred. As Jews, the family saw their properties confiscated by the Vichy regime and the occupying German forces. Chateau Lafite and Chateau Mouton Rothschild were seized, and their most precious cellars were ransacked to fuel the decadent banquets of Nazi high officials like Hermann Göring. Baron Philippe was forced to flee to London to join the Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle, while other members of the family faced the horrors of exile or death in concentration camps. The vineyards, once the battleground for family pride, became desolate landscapes of neglect and ruin, managed by uninspired administrators under the heel of the Reich. In those darkest hours, the differences between the branches dissolved in the shared agony of a family and a people being systematically hunted. When the war concluded in 1945, Philippe returned to find Mouton in a state of exhaustion, its halls scarred and its stocks depleted. However, instead of despairing, he chose the monumental 1945 vintage to create one of the greatest wines of all time, featuring a label with the V for victory. This was more than just the revival of an estate. It was a profound declaration of the Rothschild family's survival against an ideology that had sought their total annihilation. Yet, with peace came the return of the old obsession, the first growth status. For the next 20 years, Philippe would embark on the most persistent political and legal lobbying campaign in French history to change the 1855 classification, a system that was considered by almost everyone else to be unchangeable. He found himself pitted directly against the Bordeaux establishment, including his own cousins at Lafite, who remained enthusiastic about the prospect of a new rival ascending to their exclusive rank. The post-war decades became the stage for an unprecedented diplomatic and legal crusade that would test the very foundations of the Bordeaux establishment. Baron Philippe de Rothschild, fueled by a mixture of ancestral pride and personal defiance, adopted a new motto for Mouton that echoed through the tasting rooms of the world. First, I cannot be. Second, I do not deign to be. Mouton I am. This was not just a clever play on words. It was a psychological warfare tactic against a rigid classification system that had remained frozen since the reign of Napoleon III. While his cousins at Chateau Lafite maintained a regal, almost detached superiority, enjoying their unchallenged status as the first of the first growths, Philippe was tirelessly lobbying the French Ministry of Agriculture. He understood that in the world of the elite, legitimacy was not just about the quality in the glass, which Mouton was consistently proving to be equal to or better than its peers. It was about the formal recognition of power. The battle for the 1855 amendment was a lonely one, as the other first growths, including the directors of Lafayette, feared that reopening the classification would invite chaos and devalue their own exclusive status. The tension between the two Rothschild estates reached a fever pitch during the 1960s, as the global wine market began to expand and the financial stakes grew higher. It was no longer a private family disagreement. It was a public spectacle of two different philosophies of power. At Lafayette, Baron Elie de Rothschild represented the traditionalist wing of the family, focused on maintaining the estate's aura of timeless, effortless elegance. At Mouton, Philippe was busy transforming the vineyard into a global cultural brand, inviting the world's greatest artists, from Braque and Dali to Miro and eventually Picasso, to design his annual labels. This move was viewed by the traditionalists at Lafayette as a vulgar commercialization of a sacred craft. To them, the wine should speak for itself without the need for artistic gimmicks. However, Philippe's genius was in recognizing that the old money world was changing, and that to survive, the Rothschild name had to command not just the cellar, but the imagination of the new global elite. The silent halls of Lafayette and the vibrant, art-filled galleries of Mouton became the two opposing poles of the Rothschild wine identity. In 1973, after 20 years of relentless pressure and a masterful navigation of French bureaucracy, Philippe achieved the impossible. Jacques Chirac, then the Minister of Agriculture, signed the decree that officially elevated Chateau Mouton Rothschild to the rank of Premier Cru. It was the only change ever made to the 1855 classification since its inception. Philippe immediately updated his motto to, "First I am, second I was, Mouton does not change." While this was a monumental victory for the English Parisian branch, it sent shockwaves through the French branch at Lafayette. The singular prestige of being the only Rothschild first growth was gone. The road between the two estates, once a physical boundary, now felt like a front line. This elevation, however, was not just about a label. It signaled a shift in the family's internal hierarchy. Mouton had proven that it could challenge the status quo and win, forcing the more conservative branches of the family to recognize that the modern era demanded a more aggressive and visible form of leadership. As the 1970s progressed into the 1980s, a new generation of Rothschilds began to take the reins, inheriting a legacy that was both a blessing and a burden. At Lafayette, Baron Eric de Rothschild took over in 1974, bringing a more global and dynamic outlook that began to mirror some of Philippe's earlier innovations. The rivalry started to soften into a form of high-stakes collaboration as the family realized that the Rothschild name was more powerful when unified than when divided by petty classifications. They began to look beyond the borders of France, seeking to colonize the new world of wine. This era saw the birth of Opus One in California, a groundbreaking partnership between Philippe and Robert Mondavi, and Lafayette's expansion into South America with Los Vascos. The secret battles for control were moving from the local soil of Pauillac to a global chessboard. Yet, the question of legacy remained. How could a family so deeply rooted in European history maintain its soul while becoming a multinational luxury conglomerate? The answers lay in the soil of the vineyards themselves, which remained the only constant in a world of shifting financial markets and changing tastes. The global expansion of the Rothschild wine empire in the late 20th century was not merely a commercial venture. It was a strategic colonization of the New World that sought to prove the family's philosophy of excellence was universal. By the late 1970s, the traditional boundaries of Bordeaux felt too restrictive for the soaring ambitions of both branches. At Mouton, Baron Philippe de Rothschild made a move that shocked the viticultural world, a handshake agreement with Robert Mondavi to create Opus One in the Napa Valley. This was a seismic event in history, merging the centuries-old, old world prestige of the Rothschilds with the technical innovation and brash energy of California. To Philippe, this was the ultimate validation of his brand, that a Rothschild could plant a flag in foreign soil and still produce a wine that commanded the respect of the global elite. However, this partnership was also a secret maneuver to stay ahead of the cousins at Lafayette. The competition had moved from the gravel of Pauillac to the volcanic soils of Oakville, as each branch sought to define what a modern wine dynasty should look like in an era of globalization. Not to be outdone, the French branch at Chateau Lafayette, under the stewardship of Baron Eric de Rothschild, began its own quiet but relentless expansion. Eric, possessing the quintessential Rothschild trait of patient calculation, looked towards South America. In 1988, the family acquired Los Vascos in Chile, recognizing that the high altitudes and pristine conditions of the Colchagua Valley offered a new frontier for the Cabernet Sauvignon grape. This move was distinct from the flamboyant partnership of Opus One. It was a long-term investment in land and heritage, reflecting Lafite's historical preference for understated dominance over flash marketing. While Mouton was making headlines with celebrity artists and Napa glamour, Lafite was building an invisible empire of quality across continents. This period saw the family's influence stretch from the granite hills of Portugal's Quinta do Carmo to the vast, untapped potential of the Chinese market. The secret battles for control were no longer just about who had the best wine in Bordeaux, but about who would own the future of the global luxury palate. This era of expansion, however, brought with it the curse of the name, the immense pressure to maintain the Rothschild standard across dozens of different labels and price points. The family had to navigate the delicate balance between being an exclusive, aristocratic producer and a multinational beverage conglomerate. The rise of the super-rich in Asia during the 1990s and 2000s created a speculative bubble that centered almost entirely on the Rothschild brand, specifically Chateau Lafite. In China, the name Lafite became synonymous with ultimate power and status, leading to prices that defied economic logic and, tragically, a massive market for counterfeits. The family found themselves in a new kind of war, a war against the dilution of their own legacy. They had to implement high-tech anti-counterfeiting measures, including proof tag, bubble seals and intricate engraving, turning their ancient wine bottles into pieces of secure financial currency. The haunted aspect of their grandeur became the burden of protecting a name that had become so valuable it was now a target for global syndicates of fraud. As the original titans of the wine revolution passed away, Baron Philippe in 1988 and the elder statesmen of the French branch, the leadership fell to a new generation, most notably Baroness Philippine de Rothschild at Mouton and later Saskia de Rothschild at Lafite. Philippine, a former actress, brought a theatrical grandeur back to Mouton, finishing her father's dream of a dedicated wine museum and solidifying the estate's cultural dominance. Meanwhile, Saskia's ascent at Lafite in 2018 marked a significant turning point, the first female-led of the French branch, bringing a renewed focus on environmental sustainability and a more grounded, transparent approach to the family's history. The rivalry that once defined the family had evolved into a sophisticated, dual monarchy. They realized that in the 21st century, the greatest threat was not each other, but the changing climate and the shifting tides of social values. The battle for legacy was no longer about who was first, but about whose vineyards would survive the next century of environmental upheaval, ensuring that the Rothschild name remained etched into the soil long after the gold in their banks had changed form. The final chapter of the Rothschild wine empire is one of quiet synthesis and a profound reckoning with the future. As we enter the mid-2020s, the fierce competition that once defined the relationship between Chateau Lafite and Chateau Mouton Rothschild has matured into a sophisticated, dual stewardship of the Bordeaux identity. The modern battlefield is no longer the halls of the French Ministry of Agriculture, but the erratic climate of the Gironde. Both branches of the family have shifted their immense resources toward environmental resilience, transitioning to organic and biodynamic farming practices to preserve the precious terroir that has been their foundation since 1853. Saskia de Rothschild, representing the sixth generation at Lafite, and the children of the late Baroness Philippine at Mouton, have embraced a philosophy of radical transparency. They are no longer just the silent owners of a bank, they are visible curators of a landscape. The secret battles for control have been replaced by a shared necessity to protect the Rothschild name from the volatility of a world that increasingly questions the morality of inherited wealth and colonial-era legacies. The grandeur of the Rothschild wine empire remains haunted by its own excellence, the persistent challenge of living up to a label that has become a global benchmark for perfection. Today, the estates serve as living museums where the past is constantly being renegotiated. In the cellars of Lafite, where the air is thick with the scent of damp earth and aging oak, the bottles from 1868 still rest in silent rows, representing a continuity that few other dynasties can claim. Meanwhile, at Mouton, the Paintings for the Labels gallery stands as a monument to the family's ability to bridge the gap between high commerce and high art. The legacy of the secret battles is now a part of the brand's allure, a narrative of ambition that adds a layer of intellectual complexity to every glass poured in the boardrooms of New York, the penthouses of Shanghai, and the palaces of Europe. The family has successfully navigated the transition from 19th-century plutocrats to 21st-century cultural icons, using wine as the medium to maintain their relevance in a post-monarchical world. As the morning sun breaks through the mist over the gravelly plateaus of Pollack, illuminating the stone facades of both Lafite and Mouton, it becomes clear that the wine empire is more than just a collection of assets. It is a psychological fortress. The Rothschilds did not just buy vineyards, they bought time. They understood that while financial markets fluctuate and empires fall, the human desire for the sublime, represented by a perfect vintage, is eternal. The story of the Rothschild wine empire is ultimately a story of the human heart's pursuit of permanence. From Nathaniel's first humble purchase to the global hegemony of the modern day, the family has used the vine to weave themselves into the very soil of France. They have proven that while gold can be spent, a legacy built on the land, nurtured through rivalry, and tempered by history, is a treasure that can never truly be exhausted. The battles may be over, but the wine remains, a liquid testament to a family that refused to be second, and in doing so, became the standard by which all others are measured. Quote,